and really to continue the series of when we flew to New York with my wife and son, because my mother was on her deathbed. She had had a series of strokes, and it became a long, drawn out process. It ended up being a month, and originally we flew there to spend 2 weeks, and we didn't realize. So if you followed the last video, we drove back to Syracuse from Gettysburg in Washington, as my wife had been inebriated the entire way. And we had to cut that trip short because my son and I just couldn't really stand being in the car with her any longer. So the day we got back to my dad's house, unfortunately, we had to have a family meeting, and it was probably the toughest meeting I ever had. It was my brother, my dad, my sister, and we really had to decide. I think it was time to pull the plug really on my mother, to stop her from, the food, from food and water, and it was really time to shut the machines off. She didn't have any quality of life. She had, I think, 18% brain activity. She was physically immobile, and she was having trouble breathing, and she was in horrible pain. There was no quality of life yet. So after all the havoc that I'd been through the last 3 weeks, I had to come home, and we had to make this decision. And the only reason why I mention this is because so many families have to go through this type of thing. There's always some crazy, horrible thing going on. Maybe someone in your life is passing away, and you end up spending so much time and energy and effort dealing with the alcoholic in your family, and it takes away from being able to spend the last moments or the last days of time with your loved one. It takes away from being able to mourn them, and it takes away from really anything that would be normalized in one's life, because the alcohol takes everything away, and all the focus has to be on the alcohol and the alcoholic. And it's a very tough thing. The reason why I expose this, talk about this, because I know there are thousands, if not millions, of families that go through some variance of what I'm talking about. And then there was one last incident that happened while we were at my dad's house, and this was actually after my mother had passed away, and the funeral. And I remember there's a lot of people at my dad's house, and I was sitting in the family room. And in the family room, my parents always had this little wine rack, and it held like 8 bottles of wine. And it was on the hearth. They had this big, huge hearth. It's an East Coast house, stone masonry, but there was 8 bottles of wine there, and they were bottles that were like given to them on their 25th wedding anniversary, their 50th wedding anniversary, special bottles, champagne. And couple bottles were from my cousins. They had a winery, and they'd given them a couple bottles, very special bottles. My parents have been married for 60 years, on that note too. And I was sitting in the family room, and I thought we had gotten all the alcohol out of the house when we came back from Gettysburg. My brother and sister really made a point to make sure there was no alcohol, and we had forgotten about these bottles. And I remember sitting in the family room with all these people in here, and I glanced over, and I remembered those 8 bottles. But they were like family folklore, and I write about this in the book because it was just mind-blowing. And when I had a moment, when everybody walked out of the room, I walked over to the bottles. I just wanted to make sure they were still full, and I picked them up, and the cork was out of the one. It was my parents' 50th wedding anniversary. Somebody had given it to him. It was a real high-end bottle, and the cork was half out. And I pulled the cork out, and I smelled it, and I put the cork back in, and it was full of water. My wife had taken all these precious bottles of wine, these very significant and metaphoric bottles of wine, and drank all of them, somehow staying with my parents. And it was more embarrassment that I could take at this time. This is the day we're burying my mother, and I just realized that she had just crossed every boundary and destroyed every boundary and drank these precious bottles of wine. And I just sat there, and I was so embarrassed and mortified that I was almost speechless. And this was, I didn't even have the ability really to mourn my mother. I was more mortified for what my wife was pulling off while staying with my dad. And really the reason why I go over this so much, this was 10 years ago. We've long since moved on. It has nothing really to do with me, what's going on now, but it's to recognize the depth of just incredible situations that families have to go through and what they have to deal with. And there has to be a voice for the family. I understand it's a mental health disease. This is not a time to talk about the alcoholic. This is not to disparage the alcoholic or Amanda or anyone for that matter. But it's to understand what families go through and the emotions that they have to go through on a regular basis. And then for some people to say, oh, what's your culpability in this situation? Why did you cause this? Or what's making Amanda do all this stuff? And it has absolutely nothing to do with the family, as the family spends so much time and energy and effort trying to save their loved one. And then they become the fall guy because of ignorance from the outside world. And this is something that needs to stop. This is the fundamental reason why I make these. The family is not the problem. Certainly not the second family. Certainly maybe an earlier in life, the family you grew up with, that could be the trauma, that can be the culture, but not one that you marry into. And this is just absolutely got to be understood. If you took anything away from these videos, I hope I speak for families. And I think it was a year later, my dad called me up and he goes, Andy, we checked one of those bottles of wine. This is a year later, like 2016. My dad goes, you know what, Andy, we checked one of the bottles of wine, our 50th wedding anniversary wine, and it was full of water. Do you think Amanda might have drank it? And I said, yeah, Dad, I think she probably did. And he was just like, okay. He was just kind of nonplussed. And I could tell that it really hurt him, that this thing that he had for his 50th anniversary with his wife was gone because of my wife. These are things that family have to go through, and the embarrassment and just all of this. Okay, I hope that makes sense. And again, these stories and others are in Amanda, A Cautionary Tale of Alcoholism. She was a kind, loving person, intelligent, and she was a very beautiful woman. Alcohol took all of that away. It's never to disparage. I tell these stories for awareness and make it normalized to talk about this stuff, because it needs to be talked about, because unless it's talked about, exposed for what it is, it's never going to change. And I really hope that makes sense.